My name is Hannah Cooper. I am 33, and when my father passed away in Denver, the only thing he left just for me was his treasured Rolex watch, a piece of our family's history. I thought it was safe until whispers in my mother's house revealed the truth. The watch had been sold behind my back, not to pay debts, not to survive hardship, but to fund my stepbrother Ethan's extravagant wedding. I felt my world tilt, grief turning into betrayal, until a stranger's phone call confirmed everything I feared. From that moment, every step I took pulled me deeper into secrets my family never wanted exposed. And the way it all unfolded in front of hundreds of witnesses is something you will not forget. That Denver winter of 2022 is burned into my memory. The cold cut straight through my coat as I walked out of the hospital after the doctor told me it was over. Heart failure, they said, but to me it felt like the world had simply stopped moving. The cold cut straight through my coat as I walked out of the hospital after the doctor told me it was over. Heart failure, they said, but to me it felt like the world had simply stopped moving. My father, Richard Cooper, had been my anchor. Without him, everything around me suddenly felt unstable and loud. I had spent so many years carving out a career in marketing, running campaigns for tech companies, but nothing in that world prepared me for losing the one person who always made me feel steady. For as long as I can remember, Sundays were our ritual. He would cook something simple, usually roast chicken or his favorite chili, and we would sit at the kitchen table together. He would always slip his left sleeve back and check the time on his Rolex Datejust, the watch his own father had handed down to him decades earlier. That watch was more than steel and gold. It was the pulse of our family, ticking through graduations, birthdays, first jobs, and heartbreaks. He used to tell me that every second it measured was proof that we could start again, no matter how rough the week had been. One Sunday years before he passed, I asked him why he still wore such an old watch when he could afford newer, fancier ones. He smiled in that quiet way he had and said, "Time is the one thing you can never buy back. Your grandfather gave me this watch when I left for college. He told me that every glance at it should remind me not to waste a single moment, and now it reminds me of him. Someday, Hannah, I want it to remind you of me." At the time, I brushed it off, thinking he was just being sentimental, but his words stayed tucked in a corner of my mind. When the lawyer read the will a few weeks after the funeral, my heart clenched as if he had spoken those words again. Almost everything my father owned was designated for charity. The house he had lived in for 30 years was to be sold, and the funds donated to a foundation he had admired. His modest investments were split among several nonprofits. But then the lawyer paused and said my name. The Rolex Datejust worn by Richard Cooper for nearly 40 years is to be passed on to his daughter, Hannah Cooper. This watch is a symbol of time well spent and a reminder that she was the most valuable part of my time on Earth. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I didn't hear the rest of the legal phrases. All I could hear was my father's voice, steady and warm, telling me again that I mattered most. After the reading, my mother Margaret pressed the small leather case into my hands. Her own eyes were red, though hers had a distant, complicated look. She had remarried years ago to Gregory Wilson, and since then our relationship had grown strained. Still in that moment, she said softly, "He wanted you to have it, Hannah. Keep it safe." I nodded, but in the rush of funeral arrangements, relatives flying in and out, and legal paperwork, I decided to leave it in her safe at the house for the time being. It felt wrong to wear it right away, almost like pretending I had moved on too quickly. I told myself I would bring it home once the dust settled. The days after were a blur. I threw myself back into work at the agency, filling my schedule with presentations and client calls, but the quiet at night was unbearable. Every time I set my phone on the nightstand, I imagined the weight of that Rolex sitting next to it, ticking away in the dark. Sometimes I would sit up in bed and whisper, "Dad, I hope you know I'm trying," even though no one was there to answer. The watch had become the only tangible bridge left between us, and though it wasn't physically in my possession, yet I felt its presence like a heartbeat. One evening, I drove to my mother's house. The lights in the front windows glowed against the snow, and as I pulled into the driveway, I realized how different the house felt now. Without my father in it, the air seemed hollow. I sat in the car longer than I should have, remembering the times I had run up those same steps, hair damp from the pool or arms full of college books, and always found him in the kitchen with that same smile. I finally walked up and knocked. My mother opened the door with a tired expression. She hugged me, but it was brief, almost distracted. Inside the house smelled of cinnamon tea. The Rolex was still in the safe, she assured me, and she promised I could come by to collect it whenever I felt ready. I told her I just wasn't prepared yet, and she patted my hand like she understood. That night back in my apartment, I unfolded the copy of the will the lawyer had given me. I read the lines over and over until my eyes burned. The Rolex is to be passed on to my daughter Hannah Cooper. This watch is a symbol of time well spent and a reminder that she was the most valuable part of my time on Earth. I pressed the paper against my chest, letting the words sink into me like a blanket. The tears came in heavy waves, but they didn't feel empty. They felt like a release, like my father was still finding a way to speak to me even from beyond the grave. I wiped my eyes and whispered into the silence of my apartment, "I'll keep it safe, Dad. I promise." And with that promise echoing in my mind, I finally turned out the light. The following weekend, my mother called and asked me to come over for dinner. She said it would be nice to sit together again, that Gregory was making steak and she already had a bottle of Merlot breathing on the counter. I hesitated but agreed, knowing she really meant she wanted me to join a family dinner with her new household, the one that had never quite felt like mine. When I pulled into the driveway, Gregory's Cadillac Escalade gleamed under the porch lights, polished so perfectly it reflected the street lamp across the road. The house was louder now than it ever had been when my father lived there. Voices carried out through the open windows, laughter and music tumbling into the cold air. I took a deep breath and rang the bell. My mother opened the door quickly and pulled me in. Her perfume was heavy floral, the kind she only wore when she wanted to impress. Inside, Gregory stood in the kitchen with a glass of red wine in hand, his booming voice filling every corner. His son Ethan leaned against the counter, phone in hand, not looking up until my mother nudged him. Ethan gave me a half smile and said hey, as if I had interrupted something important. He was 36 now, but he still had that restless energy of a man waiting for someone else to solve his problems. We sat down at the dining table, the long oak one my father had once refinished by hand. It felt strange to see it covered in an elaborate spread with candles and embroidered napkins. Gregory carved the steak while he talked about the dealerships, how sales were up even in a tough market, how he was expanding into Colorado Springs next year. My mother laughed and touched his arm, her eyes shining with the admiration I had once hoped to see directed at me. Ethan finally set his phone down when my mother mentioned Chloe. Apparently, they had just finalized the date for the wedding. She looked at me then, almost expectantly, and said it was going to be a beautiful spring ceremony. Chloe was already busy with her friends picking colors for the bridesmaids' dresses. I nodded politely, thinking of the few times I had met Chloe. She was kind, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who offered to bring homemade cookies to every gathering. I wondered if she noticed the way Ethan let conversations drift past him, or the way his plans always seemed to fall apart before they began. Gregory lifted his glass and said a wedding for the Wilson family had to be done right. No cutting corners, no backyard receptions. He said he wanted to book one of the most exclusive venues in Denver, the kind that had chandeliers glittering like diamonds and a ballroom big enough to hold 300 guests. My mother clasped her hands together and said, "Of course, Ethan deserved nothing less." Then she turned to me with that same expectant look, as if waiting for me to agree. I forced a smile and said it sounded lovely. My words felt stiff in my throat. Gregory launched into details about live music and signature cocktails, his voice growing louder as the wine worked through him. Ethan chuckled at a joke his father made about open bars and groomsmen, and for a moment it felt like I was watching a show where everyone knew their lines except me. I kept glancing at my mother. She never once mentioned my father that evening, not even as the conversation swirled around weddings and futures. The Rolex in her safe felt like the only tether left between me and the man who had raised me. Yet here she was, eyes bright for Gregory's promises, laughing at Ethan's careless remarks, as if the family we had once been was nothing more than a chapter to be quietly turned. When dessert came out, a rich chocolate mousse Chloe had apparently requested for the rehearsal dinner, my mother leaned toward Ethan and said he had so much potential that all he ever needed was the right opportunity. Gregory nodded proudly, adding that once Ethan settled down with Chloe, he was sure to find his path. I swallowed hard, remembering all the times she had brushed off my achievements with a quick remark but always circled back to Ethan. He could fail at 3 different business ventures in a row, and still she would defend him as someone who just needed a bit more time. No one asked me how work was going. No one asked how I was coping without Dad. They spoke as if I wasn't even at the table, as if my chair was just a placeholder. I toyed with the silver spoon in my hand, forcing myself to nod along to their chatter. The laughter, the plans for a wedding dripping with grandeur, the talk of Ethan's potential all pressed down on me like a weight. I sat in silence, my eyes fixed on the flicker of the candles. My mother's gaze brushed over me once, quick and uneasy, before she turned back to Gregory. The air was thick with cheer, but I felt like a ghost at my own family's table, unseen and unnecessary. When the plates were cleared and the wine glasses refilled, I excused myself earlier than anyone expected. My mother kissed my cheek quickly at the door. Gregory called after me to drive safe, and Ethan had already gone back to his phone. Walking to my car, the night felt sharper, the cold cutting at my cheeks. I slid into the driver's seat and sat there for a long moment, listening to the sound of my own breath. The lights from the dining room glowed through the curtains, warm and golden, but I no longer belonged in that glow. I turned the key in the ignition and let the engine rumble, staring once more at the house that had once been mine too. The distance between us had never felt wider. The following week, I decided to stop by my mother's house earlier than she expected. She had invited me for another family dinner, but something in me told me I needed to come before the crowd gathered. I pulled up the driveway, the afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the front lawn, and let myself in with the spare key she still kept hidden under the porch mat. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that usually meant no one had arrived home yet. But as I closed the door softly behind me, I caught the low murmur of voices drifting from Gregory's study. The heavy oak door was half closed, a line of light cutting across the hallway carpet. I hesitated, my hand tightening on my purse strap before inching closer. Inside, Gregory's deep voice carried easily. He was laughing, satisfied, as if he had just sealed some sort of deal. Ethan answered, his tone lighter, almost giddy. I froze when I caught the words that followed. Gregory said the watch had fetched $15,000, enough to cover the Boulder event haul, and the diamond ring Chloe had been eyeing. My stomach turned to stone. Ethan chuckled and said it was about time something worked out in his favor, that his wedding would finally look like the kind of celebration people would envy. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, that my mind was twisting words to punish me. But then Gregory mentioned my father by name, saying Richard would have wanted the family to move on, that the old Rolex was just gathering dust in a safe. The sound of my father's name reduced to a transaction punched through my chest. My pulse hammered in my ears. I pressed my palm against the wall to steady myself. That watch was not theirs to touch, not theirs to sell. It was my father's last gift to me, written into his will with care and love. The words from his letter echoed in my memory, reminding me that time was precious and I had been the most precious part of his life. The betrayal burned hotter than anything I had ever felt. Before I realized what I was doing, my hand was on the doorknob. I shoved it open, and the door slammed against the wall. Both men jerked their heads toward me. Gregory's face went pale, Ethan's mouth hung open. For a split second, no one spoke. My voice cut through the room sharper than I intended as I demanded to know where my father's watch was. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his father. Gregory cleared his throat, setting down his glass of scotch. He tried to speak in that steady, commanding tone he always used, but I caught the crack at the edge of it. He said I must have misunderstood, that they were only talking about options, that nothing had been finalized. I stepped farther into the room, my fists clenched at my sides. I told them I had heard every word, that I knew exactly what they had done. My father's Rolex had been sold like it was a trinket, and they had the audacity to use it to fund a wedding. My voice shook, not from weakness, but from rage that threatened to break free. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind me, her face stricken, her hands twisting nervously. She asked what was going on in a quiet voice, though her eyes already carried guilt. When I turned to her and asked if she knew, she looked away, her silence louder than any denial. The room grew heavier with every second. Gregory finally leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening, and admitted that the watch had been taken to a shop in downtown Denver. He insisted it was only temporary, that he planned to replace it with something better, something modern that I could wear proudly. The words scraped at me like broken glass. He had reduced my father's legacy to a bargain, as if sentiment could be traded for market value. Ethan muttered that it was just a watch, that I was overreacting. His casual dismissal hit me harder than the confession itself. I snapped that it was not just a watch, it was my father's promise, a piece of him I could never replace. My mother flinched but still avoided my eyes. The silence that followed was unbearable. My chest felt tight, my throat raw. I could not stand in that room another second without screaming. I turned and walked out, brushing past my mother, who reached for my arm but stopped short. My heels struck the floor harder than I intended as I made my way down the hall, out the front door, and into the open air. The sky above Boulder was fading into dusk, streaks of orange and purple bleeding into the horizon. I stood by my car for a long time, trying to catch my breath. The betrayal replayed in my head, every word they had spoken echoing in cruel detail. $15,000, a ballroom, a diamond ring, all at the cost of my father's memory. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles whitened. I told myself I would not let this go. That watch was mine, written into the will, a final act of love from my father. They could twist words, make excuses, pretend it was harmless, but the truth was simple. They had stolen it. As I started the engine, the thought of confronting them again twisted my stomach. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would find that watch, and I would make them answer for what they had done. The next evening, I forced myself to sit at the long dining table in my mother's house. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic bread filled the room, but I could barely swallow a sip of water. My mother had insisted I come, claiming we needed to clear the air. Gregory sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his kingdom. Ethan lounged beside him with his phone out, and my mother kept glancing between us, already tense before the conversation even began. I broke the silence first. I said I wanted the watch back, that it belonged to me by law and by my father's wishes. My voice was steady, though my chest burned with anger. Gregory leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and with that calm, patronizing tone he always used, said it was just a watch. His words felt like a slap. I told him it was not just a watch, it was my father's legacy, and it was specifically written in his will. Ethan smirked without looking up from his phone. He said the watch had done something useful for once, that it was helping his wedding become the kind of event the whole town would talk about. He looked at me like I was petty, like I was the problem for making a scene. My mother tried to smooth things over, her voice soft but her words cutting. She said family helps family, that my father would have wanted us to take care of each other. I could not believe what I was hearing. I asked her how selling the only thing he left me was taking care of anyone. She lowered her eyes, twisting her napkin until it tore in her hands. Gregory interrupted, his tone sharper now. He said the decision had been made and that I should not stir up more conflict. He insisted that Ethan and Chloe deserved a wedding that matched the Wilson family's reputation, that appearances mattered. He leaned forward and told me I should be proud the watch had served a purpose greater than sitting in a drawer. The room spun. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my fingers ached. I reminded them that my father's will was a legal document, not a suggestion, and that what they had done was theft. Ethan chuckled and muttered that no one outside this house needed to know. His arrogance made my blood boil. I turned to my mother again, pleading with her to do the right thing, to acknowledge that the watch was mine. For a moment, she looked torn, her lips parting as if to agree, but then she shook her head. She whispered that life was easier when the family stood together, that maybe I could let this one thing go. The betrayal in her eyes hollowed me out. The clinking of silverware filled the silence that followed. Gregory picked up his glass and drank like the matter was settled. Ethan grinned, leaning back as if he had won something. My appetite vanished entirely. I pushed my plate away and felt tears sting my eyes, not from weakness but from rage and disappointment. I told them they had crossed a line that could never be erased. I said my father trusted me with his last words and his most prized possession, and they had trampled on that trust. Gregory waved his hand as if dismissing a child. Ethan whispered to Chloe's name like she was the prize worth all of this, and my mother closed her eyes as though she wished I would just stop speaking. My body shook as I pulled the linen napkin from my lap. I threw it onto the table with more force than I realized, the sound sharp enough to make my mother flinch. The dishes rattled, a glass tipped slightly. I stood my chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I looked at each of them one last time. Gregory with his smug calm, Ethan with his careless smirk, and my mother with her downcast eyes. My voice came low but firm. I said I would get that watch back no matter what it took, and I would not forgive what they had done. Then I walked out, leaving the meal untouched, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out the sound of their whispers behind me. I stepped into the cool night air, inhaling sharply, and let the door close on the people who had chosen betrayal over family. Sleep refused to come, no matter how many times I flipped the pillow to its cooler side. I stared at the ceiling of my apartment, the faint city lights of Denver leaking through the blinds. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face on the day he fastened the Rolex around his wrist at my college graduation. He had lifted my hand, kissed my knuckles, and told me he was proud. The same image repeated again and again, only to be shattered by Ethan's smirk and Gregory's voice dismissing it all as just a watch. By morning, exhaustion clung to me like a heavy blanket. I dragged myself to the office, hoping routine would distract me, but it did not. During a Monday marketing strategy meeting, my mind drifted so far I barely noticed the silence in the room until my boss Lauren Parker said my name. Everyone looked at me as she asked for my input on a campaign I had helped design. Words tangled on my tongue. I muttered something vague, heat rushing to my face. Lauren's eyes softened, but her tone was firm. She asked me to stay after. When the room cleared, she closed the conference door and leaned against the table. She told me I had not been myself for weeks and asked if something was wrong at home. I tried to brush it off, but my throat tightened. She said she had lost her father years ago, that grief could eat you alive if you let it. Then she suggested I take a few days off, clear my head, and come back stronger. Her kindness made me ache because she did not know the truth. That night, I finally told Jessica. We met at a small coffee shop downtown after her long day at the law firm. She walked in with her messy bun and a stack of case files, ordered her usual black coffee, and sat across from me. The words poured out before I could stop them. I told her about the watch, the overheard conversation, the fight at the dinner table. My voice shook when I admitted my mother had sided with them. Jessica listened without interrupting, her lawyer's mind already spinning. When I finished, she leaned forward and said what they had done had a name. Theft by conversion. She explained it was when someone took property they had no right to and used it for their own benefit. She said it was not just morally wrong, but legally actionable. I blinked at her, the idea sinking in slowly. I had been drowning in hurt and betrayal, thinking of the watch as an emotional wound. Jessica reframed it as evidence, as something the law could defend. She said the will clearly assigned the Rolex to me, which meant anyone selling it had committed theft. Her voice was steady, confident, and it steadied me too. For the first time in weeks, anger sharpened into focus. I asked her what I could actually do. She told me the first step was to gather documentation, a copy of the will, proof of the watch's value, and any evidence tying Gregory or Ethan to the sale. I remembered the pawn shop receipt Ethan had let slip in his bragging, and my pulse quickened. Jessica tapped her pen on her notebook and said that paper could be the key. I sat back, stunned by how differently everything looked. It was not just me against my family, it was me standing for the truth in the eyes of the law. The Rolex was not lost forever. It could be traced, reclaimed, and defended. My father's words in the will suddenly felt like a lifeline. Jessica reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me to stop seeing myself as powerless. She reminded me of all the times I had stood up to unfair clients at work, how I always fought for my team. She said this was no different, only now I was fighting for my father's memory and for myself. The city outside the cafe buzzed with headlights and footsteps, but inside a quiet resolve began to grow in me. I sipped the last of my lukewarm latte, my shoulders lighter than when I had walked in. For weeks, I had been replaying memories trapped in grief. Now there was a direction. When we left, Jessica promised to help however she could, even if it was just pointing me toward the right resources. I hugged her longer than usual, grateful for the clarity she had given me. As I walked to my car, I replayed her words about theft by conversion. They sounded cold, clinical, but to me they carried weight. They meant justice. That night, instead of collapsing into restless tossing and turning, I spread papers across my dining table. My father's will lay in the center, his handwriting on the cover page catching the light. I ran my fingers over his name, inhaled, and began making notes. I listed everything Jessica had told me to find, every scrap of proof I could think of. The ache in my chest had not vanished, but it no longer left me paralyzed. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt a spark of control returning. My father had taught me that time was precious. I would not waste more of it in silence. I turned off the lamp past midnight, the notes stacked neatly at my side, and sat in the dark for a moment. The watch might be gone for now, but the fight for it had only just begun. The next morning I started with a list and a phone. Denver had more pawnshops than I realized, tucked into busy streets and forgotten corners, each one a possibility and a reminder of how far my father's watch could have traveled. I called one after another, explaining carefully a Rolex Datejust stainless steel with a silver dial passed down from my grandfather. Some clerks cut me off quickly, saying they had no such thing. Others listened politely before apologizing. A few seemed annoyed, telling me they heard stories like mine all the time. By the fifth call, my voice felt hoarse, but I pressed on. Each no landed like a stone in my chest. I told myself that giving up meant letting Ethan and Gregory win, and that was not an option. So I grabbed my keys, folded the list into my pocket, and started driving. Aurora was my first stop. The pawn shop was a squat building with barred windows and neon signs that flickered against the gray morning sky. Inside, the glass cases glinted with gold chains and watches that looked flashy but wrong. I described the Rolex to the man behind the counter. He shook his head and motioned toward a tray. My stomach dropped when I saw a few knockoff pieces that resembled it but lacked the weight and presence I knew by heart. I thanked him and left the bell over the door jangling behind me like a taunt. The next few days followed the same rhythm. Work felt distant, a blur of emails I barely skimmed and deadlines I pretended to track. My real job had become chasing my father's legacy through the city, one dingy shop at a time. Each time I walked into a new store, my chest filled with hope. Each time I walked out empty-handed, that hope shrank a little. At one small shop near Colfax, an older woman listened carefully as I spoke. She even pulled out a dusty catalog, flipping through pages of Rolex models. For a moment, I thought she might say yes. Instead, she sighed and closed the book. She told me she had not seen a Datejust in years. Driving home that evening, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The wedding was only weeks away. Every day that passed felt like a door closing. I kept picturing Ethan sliding a ring on Chloe's finger, my father's watch long gone, its history erased, so he could have champagne fountains and a ballroom in Boulder. Nights were the hardest. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by notes and receipts, my phone always within reach. I thought about my father's steady hand resting on mine, the way he used to tell me that persistence mattered more than luck. Those words kept me from giving up. Then, one evening as I was rinsing dishes, my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, Aurora area code. My heart skipped. I answered, bracing for another dead end. The voice on the line was gruff but kind. He introduced himself as Harold Miller, owner of a shop I had visited weeks before but left my number with. He said a Rolex had come into his store that matched my description almost exactly. My breath caught. I asked him to repeat it. He said stainless steel, silver dial, smooth bezel, and it still had a faint engraving on the back, though he could not quite make out the words. I gripped the counter so tightly my hand hurt. That engraving had been my grandfather's initials. My knees nearly buckled. Harold hesitated, then added that the men who sold it gave their names, Gregory and Ethan Wilson. The room tilted. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, trying to steady my breathing. Hearing their names attached to the sale stripped away any illusion. It was not just a suspicion or overheard whispers. It was fact. They had sold my father's watch. Harold asked if I was interested in coming by to confirm it. My voice cracked as I said yes, absolutely. He told me to come in the next day, and I promised I would. After we hung up, I stood frozen in my kitchen, the sound of the faucet still running behind me. My father's watch had been reduced to a ticket for Ethan's wedding dreams. But at that moment, for the first time, I had a direct line back to it. I turned off the faucet, leaned against the counter, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow could change everything. The night passed in restless fragments, my mind circling over what Harold might show me. By the time dawn stretched pale across Denver, I was already dressed, pacing my apartment, clutching my bag as if the act of being ready would somehow make the hours move faster. Coffee went cold and the mug untouched on the counter. I kept hearing my father's voice, those quiet words he had left for me in his will about time being precious. Today, I told myself, was about honoring that. By late morning, I was in Aurora, my car nosing into the narrow lot outside Harold Miller's pawn shop. The building was squat weathered brick with a flickering neon sign buzzing faintly in the window. I sat there with the engine idling, palms slick against the steering wheel, watching a man shuffle past with a bundle of guitar cases. My chest ached with a mixture of dread and fragile hope. Then I cut the ignition and stepped out. Inside, the shop smelled faintly of metal and dust. Rows of instruments, rings, and tarnished picture frames lined the walls. Behind the counter stood Harold, tall and broad-shouldered, his gray hair slicked back neatly. His eyes met mine with something like recognition, as if he had been expecting me for years rather than hours. He gave me a nod, no wasted words, and gestured for me to follow him toward a side office. The room was small, cluttered with papers, ledgers, and boxes stacked against the walls. On the desk sat a velvet tray. My breath faltered. Resting inside was my father's Rolex. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My knees nearly buckled. The silver gleam, the familiar dial, the smooth bezel, the subtle weight of history seemed to fill the air around it. I stepped closer, the world narrowing, until all I saw was that watch. My hand shook as I reached forward, fingers hovering just above the cool metal, afraid that if I touched it, the vision might vanish. Harold's voice grounded me. He explained how two men had come in just weeks ago. They had been nervous, fumbling over details. They clearly did not know the worth of what they carried. He had asked questions, and their answers left him uneasy. Then his voice dropped, and he told me the part that made my skin crawl. They had leaned in and told him not to mention the sale to Richard's daughter. The words hit like a physical blow. It was not enough for them to steal from me. They had tried to erase me, to silence the very tie between my father and me. Heat rushed to my face, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Harold reached into a folder and pulled out a slip of paper. He held it out, and I took it with trembling hands. The receipt. Gregory Wilson's name scrawled across the signature line, dated clearly. $15,000. The amount felt obscene, pitiful compared to the true value, not in money but in memory. Tears blurred my vision as I looked down at the watch again. I whispered the initials engraved on the back, my grandfather's mark, proof of the line it had passed down. My instinct was to fasten it immediately onto my wrist to reclaim what was mine. I even bent forward, fingertips brushing the metal. But Harold gently shook his head. He told me it had to remain with him until the matter was settled properly. If I wanted it back, it had to be through the right process, through the law. He said he had run this shop for decades, seen countless shady exchanges, but this one nodded him differently. He respected Richard, and he would respect me. He promised he would testify if needed, that he would not hesitate to stand beside me. The receipt crackled as I folded it carefully. He offered me a copy, and I tucked it into my bag with the weight of a soldier arming herself for battle. My fingers pressed against the edge until they hurt, as if pain might anchor me to the moment. I asked him why he was willing to risk involving himself. He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. He said there were lines that should not be crossed, and family betrayal ranked among the worst. He had a daughter too, and the idea of her being cut out like that was something he could not ignore. I swallowed hard, fighting the lump in my throat. Gratitude mixed with grief until I could hardly speak. All I managed was a whisper of thanks, my voice breaking in the middle. When I finally stepped back into the sunlight, the day seemed brighter and harsher all at once. The receipt in my bag burned against my side, not just paper but proof. My shoes clicked on the pavement as I crossed to my car, each step heavier with resolve. I slid into the driver's seat, shut the door, and sat in silence. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed swollen eyes, but beneath them was a steadiness I had not seen in weeks. I drew a deep breath, pulled the receipt out once more, and traced Gregory's name with my thumb. It was not just theft, it was documented theft. And that meant the law could not ignore it. For the first time since my father's funeral, I felt the ground solid under my feet. The Rolex was no longer just a memory I clung to in the dark. It was a tangible truth tied to me by blood and by law, and no amount of manipulation could erase that. As I started the car, the receipt lay on the passenger seat like a silent companion. I tightened my grip on the wheel. The fight had shifted. I was not just a grieving daughter anymore. I was a woman armed with evidence, ready to claim back what was mine. The next morning, I stood outside the office of William Hayes, a man whose name I had heard countless times from my father. He had been my dad's college roommate, and later his trusted attorney, the one who had helped draft the will I clutched in my folder. The building sat on a quiet street near downtown Denver, the kind of brick structure that seemed to carry its own authority. My hands trembled as I pressed the elevator button, the receipt from Harold folded carefully inside. When I entered, William was already waiting behind a polished oak desk. His hair had thinned to silver, but his eyes still held the sharpness of a man who missed nothing. He rose, shook my hand firmly, and studied me with an expression that was both kind and probing. I sat, and for a moment all the strength I had gathered threatened to spill out in tears. But I forced myself to steady my voice. I laid the will, the pawn shop receipt, and my notes on the desk. I told him everything from the Sunday dinners with my father to the moment I heard Gregory and Ethan whispering in that office. William leaned back, arms folded, his jaw tightening as I spoke. When I finished, he opened the folder, adjusted his glasses, and read each document carefully. Finally, he set them down and looked at me. He told me I was right. The Rolex was explicitly bequeathed to me in the will, and no one had the authority to sell it. What Gregory and Ethan had done was not only immoral, but unlawful. He used the phrase theft by conversion, echoing Jessica's words, and hearing it from him felt like a hammer striking truth into place. He began drafting a formal complaint, the scratch of his pen steady and deliberate. He said he would file it with the county clerk and forward everything to the local police. His voice carried the weight of certainty, but there was also something personal in it, a loyalty to my father that flickered in his tone. He paused at one point, meeting my eyes, and told me Richard would have wanted me to fight for this, not just for the watch, but for the principle of it. When I left his office, I felt lighter, as though part of the burden had shifted onto William's capable shoulders. Yet the ache in my chest remained. I stopped at a coffee shop nearby, dialing Jessica. The moment she answered, her voice warm and familiar, I spilled the details of the meeting. She grew quiet, listening, then finally said it was bigger than just a watch. It was about my father's name, about not letting them trample over his last wishes. She told me that pursuing this wasn't vengeance, it was justice, and that thought settled deep into my bones. Work, however, refused to pause. I tried to keep up, but my head swam during meetings. At one point, while presenting a campaign idea, I lost my place entirely. My boss, Lauren Parker, shot me a look that was both concerned and calculating. After the meeting, she pulled me aside into her office. She asked if everything was all right. Her tone was not harsh, but it cut straight through me. I admitted I was dealing with serious family issues, legal matters I couldn't ignore. Lauren leaned back in her chair, studying me. Then she surprised me by offering a few days off, saying that sometimes the best way to protect work was to step away long enough to fix life outside of it. I nodded gratefully, promising I would return sharper, more focused. The next 2 days blurred together with phone calls and paperwork. William updated me regularly, his voice firm on the line. He had filed the complaint, and the police had opened a case. I could almost hear the machinery of justice grinding forward, slow but unstoppable. Each update calmed me, but also stirred a restless anticipation. Late one afternoon, as I sat at my dining table with Jessica flipping through the documents, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. The officer on the other end identified himself, explained that the case had been reviewed and that action would indeed be taken. My fingers clutched the phone tighter, my breath catching as he continued. They intended to recover the Rolex and hold Gregory and Ethan accountable. The officer asked if there was a time or place where their presence would have the most impact, where they could ensure both the return of the property and the delivery of a clear message. My mind spun, and then it came to me. The wedding. Ethan's grand event in Boulder, the one they had boasted about, the one where they planned to flaunt their success. If justice was going to strike, let it strike where the whole facade was on display. I told the officer about the date, the location, and my reasons. He paused, then agreed it would be effective. After the call ended, I sat back staring at Jessica. My voice was barely above a whisper as I told her what had been decided. Her eyes widened, then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said my father would be proud. Not because of the drama of it, but because I had stood my ground, because I had demanded the truth come to light where no one could hide. I lay awake that night, the ceiling a blur above me. My mind replayed the moment I would see them confronted, the lies unraveling in front of everyone they had tried so hard to impress. Fear mingled with anticipation, but underneath it all was a steady calm I had not felt before. The law was on my side, the evidence was in my hands. The time was set. And as the silence of the night pressed close, I exhaled slowly, knowing the stage was being prepared for a reckoning no one could stop. The morning of Ethan's wedding dawned bright and crisp, the sky over Boulder painted a flawless blue. I drove up the mountain road, the city of Denver shrinking behind me, the air thinning and sharpening as the car climbed. My dress hung neatly in the back seat, chosen carefully, not extravagant but elegant enough to command attention. The closer I got to the hotel, the more I felt my pulse quicken. Today was not only his celebration. It was also the moment everything would come into the light. The resort hotel sat perched like a jewel on the hillside, its glass facade glittering in the sun. Rows of rented luxury cars gleamed in the circular driveway, black SUVs and polished sports cars lined up to impress. I pulled into a side lot and cut the engine, watching as valet attendants in white gloves whisked away vehicles of guests who stepped out laughing, their gowns and suits catching the light. Inside the lobby, I was met with an explosion of color and scent. Dozens of arrangements of white roses and lilies towered from golden stands, their fragrance thick in the air. Crystal chandeliers glowed from the ceiling of the grand ballroom, scattering light across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their notes mingling with the chatter of guests. Gregory stood near the entrance to the ballroom, shaking hands, his tailored suit stretched across his broad shoulders. His smile was fixed and proud, the kind of smile of a man who believed he had won. Margaret hovered at his side in a sparkling navy gown, clasping the arm of an old family friend and speaking animatedly. I caught the words successful, thriving, and deserving drifting toward me, each one like a small blade. Then I saw Ethan. He was dressed in a custom tuxedo, his hair slicked back, his chest puffed with pride. He moved among the guests like he owned the room, clapping shoulders, laughing too loudly, making jokes that drew forced chuckles. He looked every bit the man he had always tried to convince others he was. For a moment, I almost pitied him, the fragility of his confidence so obvious to anyone willing to see beneath the surface. And then Chloe appeared, the bride in lace and satin. She floated through the crowd with a nervous smile, her veil pinned delicately, her hands clutching a bouquet of ivory roses. Her eyes shone with the kind of happiness that belonged to someone still untouched by betrayal. My chest tightened when I looked at her, realizing she had no idea that the family she was marrying into had built their perfect day on lies. I stayed in the back of the room, at first my presence unnoticed. I could hear Gregory loudly telling a small group of guests about how Ethan had recently stepped up, how he was becoming the kind of man any father would be proud to call his son. Margaret added her own version, praising Ethan's perseverance, saying he only ever needed the right opportunity. They spoke as if polishing a statue, presenting a figure to the world that bore little resemblance to reality. I felt the weight of the receipt tucked securely in my purse, the edges worn from my constant handling. That single slip of paper was stronger than all their glittering words, sharper than any smile they could paste on. A hush rippled through the foyer as the coordinator began ushering guests into the ballroom. The golden doors swung open, revealing a space transformed. Round tables draped in cream linens stretched in perfect rows, each adorned with towering floral centerpieces. Tiny candles flickered in crystal holders, their flames reflecting off the mirrored dance floor. At the far end stood a stage framed by a massive arch of white blooms where Ethan and Chloe would take their vows. The guests filed in, settling into their seats with the excited hum of anticipation. The air was thick with perfume, and the metallic tang of champagne poured into tall flutes. I waited until the room was nearly full before I moved. Heels clicking against marble, I walked slowly into the ballroom. Heads began to turn. Conversations faltered. My dress, a deep shade of emerald, cut a sharp line through the sea of pale pastels and muted tuxedos. I felt dozens of eyes follow me as I crossed the threshold, each step steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. Margaret was the first to notice me. Her smile froze mid-sentence, her hand tightening on the arm of the man beside her. Gregory's jaw shifted, his expression sliding from pride to annoyance in the space of a second. Ethan's eyes landed on me across the room, confusion flickering before a smirk spread across his face as if daring me to ruin his day. I paused in the center of the room, the chandeliers casting their glow down on me. The quartet faltered their bows, hesitating on strings before they found their rhythm again. Whispers buzzed at the edges of the crowd. Guests leaned toward one another, murmuring questions, curious about the sudden disruption. For a moment, no one moved. It was as though the entire room held its breath, waiting to see what role I would play in this carefully staged performance. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing against my skin, but I kept my gaze steady, sweeping across the room until it landed squarely on my mother. Her eyes darted away, her lips pressing into a thin line as if she could erase me by sheer will. Gregory's chin lifted, the silent challenge of a man accustomed to control. And Ethan, standing near the stage with Chloe by his side, gave a short laugh and straightened his jacket, determined to turn even this into his moment. I took another step forward, the sound echoing in the stillness. My hands were calm at my sides, though inside me every nerve blazed like fire. This was no longer just a wedding. It was the stage for truth, the place where their masks would finally begin to crack. And as I stood there beneath the glow of the chandeliers, with the eyes of strangers and family alike fixed on me, I knew the reckoning I had waited for had finally begun to take shape. Gregory was the first to break the silence. His voice cut through the hum of whispers like a whip. "What do you think you're doing here, Hannah? This is not your place." I turned toward him slowly, my hand steady as I reached into my purse. "Do you really want me to answer that, Gregory? Because I came here to make sure every person in this room knows the truth." Margaret's face drained of color. "Sit down, Hannah," she hissed through clenched teeth. "You are embarrassing yourself." But I was already walking toward the head table, the carpet muffling my steps as I crossed the ballroom. Guests turned in their chairs to follow me with their eyes forks frozen halfway to their mouths. I reached the table and pulled out 2 folded sheets of paper, smoothing them with deliberate care. One was my father's will, the other was a receipt printed on cheap thermal paper with Gregory's name inked clearly across the top. "This is my father's Rolex," I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected. It was his watch, the one he wore every day of his life, and it was left to me in his will in black and white. I tapped the paper with my finger. But instead of honoring that, Gregory and Ethan sold it to pay for this wedding. A ripple ran through the room, gasps and murmurs rising like a wave. Chloe's hand tightened around her bouquet, her knuckles whitening as she turned to look at Ethan. Ethan laughed, the sound hollow and sharp. "You've really lost it, Hannah. Do you hear yourself? Nobody cares about an old watch. You're jealous, that's all this is. Jealous because I'm getting married. First jealous because people are here for me, not you." He leaned back in his chair, flashing a grin that made my stomach twist. I met his eyes without flinching. "Jealousy is not a crime, Ethan. Selling property that doesn't belong to you is." The words hung heavy in the air. Gregory shifted in his seat, his face red with anger. "It was just a watch," he snapped. "A piece of metal. Your father would have wanted his family to celebrate together, not fight over trinkets." I could feel heat rising in my chest, but I forced my voice to stay calm, deliberate. My father's name is written here in his own lawyer's hand. He wanted me to have it. It was not yours to sell. Margaret reached for Gregory's arm, her voice trembling as she tried to patch the cracks. Family helps family. That's all this was. Your father would understand. I turned to her, the ache in my throat almost breaking me. Don't you dare use his name to justify theft. He trusted you. He trusted all of you. Chloe's eyes darted between the papers and Ethan's smirk, confusion clouding her face. Is this true, Ethan? Did you really sell it? Ethan rolled his eyes and spread his arms wide, speaking louder, as though volume could drown the truth. She's twisting everything. We needed money for the venue, for the ring, for the things that make this day perfect. What's the big deal? It's just a watch. I felt something inside me snap. Just a watch. It was the one he wore when he walked me across the stage at graduation. The one he checked before he left the house for work every morning. The one he held in his hand the day he hugged me after my first job interview. It was more than a watch. It was him. And you sold it like it meant nothing. The room was hushed now, even the clink of glasses silenced. Chloe's lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Gregory rose halfway from his chair, pointing a finger at me. Enough of this. You will not ruin my son's wedding. Put those papers away and leave. I took a step closer to the table, my heart hammering, but my hands steady. This is not just about me. This is about respect for the man who built this family and the law you decided didn't apply to you. I set the will down flat on the table beside the crisp white napkins and untouched champagne flutes. Then I placed the receipt next to it, the inked name glaring under the ballroom lights. The truth, I said, is right here. A cold silence settled over the room, so heavy it pressed against my chest. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone coughed, another cleared their throat. All eyes were fixed on the table where I stood. Ethan gave another short laugh, but it cracked at the edges. Nobody here cares, Hannah. You're pathetic. I turned to him, my voice low but sharp. We'll see about that. As if on cue, the heavy ballroom doors creaked open. The sound echoed across the marble floor, drawing every head toward the entrance. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, their presence cutting through the air like a blade. I stood frozen for a moment, watching as they crossed the threshold, the glint of their badges catching the chandelier's light, and in that instant the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The first officer stepped forward, his presence commanding the silence of the ballroom as though he had rehearsed it 1,000 times. His voice carried across the polished floor and the towering arrangements of roses. We are here regarding the unlawful sale of personal property belonging to the late Richard Cooper. Specifically, a Rolex Submariner watch designated in his last will and testament to his daughter Hannah Cooper. Evidence indicates the item was sold without consent of the rightful heir. The murmur that followed was sharp, slicing through the air like glass breaking. Every head turned toward me, some with pity, others with curiosity, a few with thinly veiled judgment. My throat tightened, but I held my ground. With steady hands, I drew the folded envelope from my clutch and placed it on the table before the officers. This is my father's will, notarized and signed. His attorney, William Hayes, can verify its authenticity. One officer took the document while the other gestured toward the piece of paper already spread on the linen tablecloth. The pawn receipt, ink still crisp with Gregory Wilson's signature scrawled at the bottom. Is this linked to the watch in question? He asked. Before I could respond, a familiar voice broke through the hushed tension. Yes, sir, it is. Harold Miller stepped out from among the crowd, his graying hair catching the chandelier light, his shoulders squared with resolve. I own Miller's Pawn in Aurora. These 2 gentlemen, Gregory Wilson and Ethan Cooper, brought in a Rolex Submariner 2 weeks ago. They sold it for $15,000 cash. He paused, glancing at me briefly before continuing. They specifically told me not to mention anything to Richard's daughter, which immediately raised red flags for me. I held on to the documents and contacted her when she came searching. The gasps that erupted were almost physical. Chloe, standing radiant in her lace gown, turned to Ethan with eyes wide as though she had never seen him before. Tell me this isn't true. Please tell me this isn't what it sounds like. Ethan's face blanched, the color draining until he looked like he might faint. He stammered, his voice cracking. "Chloe, it was just to cover some costs. The wedding, the venue, the ring. I was going to make it right." Gregory straightened, puffing out his chest, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "This is family business. We had every right to use that watch. Family helps family." The taller officer fixed him with a hard stare. "That is not how the law sees it. Property allocated in a will belongs to the heir alone. Selling it without her consent is theft by conversion, punishable under Colorado law." Margaret collapsed back into her chair, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her voice broke as she grabbed Gregory's arm. "Please stop, please. Richard would never want this. He would not want his family torn apart like this." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "He would not want his family disrespected either. He trusted you to honor his wishes. You betrayed him and you betrayed me." Chloe's hands shook as she lifted her left hand. The diamond ring that had sparkled so proudly only an hour before seemed suddenly heavy-tainted. "You let me wear this," she whispered, tears brimming. "You paid for this with stolen money." With a sharp tug, she slid it off her finger and set it down on the table. The small clink as it touched the glass plate rang louder than any applause could have. "I can't do this." Ethan lunged forward, his voice cracking. "Chloe, please don't leave, I can fix this." But Chloe's gown swished as she turned and strode across the ballroom, her bouquet slipping from her grasp and scattering petals across the marble floor. Gasps and whispers followed her, but she never looked back. The younger officer stepped in, his tone firm but controlled. "Gregory Wilson and Ethan Cooper, you are under investigation for theft and fraudulent conversion of estate property. We ask that you come with us voluntarily at this time." Gregory sputtered, his bravado breaking. "This is a mistake. It's all a misunderstanding. You can't humiliate us like this in front of everyone." Ethan's lips trembled, his eyes darting across the crowd as though searching for someone to shield him. The confidence he had carried so arrogantly all week was gone. Margaret sobbed louder, clutching her pearls, whispering Richard's name as if he might appear to stop what was already in motion. The officers each took one man by the arm, firm but not brutal, and began leading them through the aisle between the rows of stunned guests. The heavy oak doors groaned as they opened. The click of polished shoes and the shuffle of their resistance echoed beneath the chandeliers. Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering into hands, eyes darting to me, to the will, to the empty space where Chloe had stood only moments before. Some looked away in shame, others watched openly, hungry for scandal. I remained still, my hands folded in front of me, my heart pounding against my ribs. It was not triumph I felt, but a grim confirmation. Justice was rarely neat, rarely celebratory. But it was necessary. The doors shut with a resonant thud, leaving behind the faint trace of Margaret's weeping and the shattered silence of what had been planned as a perfect wedding. For a long moment, no one moved. The chandeliers glittered above as if mocking the ruin below. I drew in a breath, steadying myself. The lies had been dragged into the open, and there was no going back. The night had changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone who had witnessed the truth unveiled in the harshest light possible. Morning sunlight spilled across my kitchen table when the call finally came. The officer's voice was steady, almost gentle, as he told me the Rolex had been processed, logged, and cleared for release. My father's watch, the one that had felt stolen from my very heartbeat, was waiting for me at the precinct. I thanked him with a voice that shook more than I wanted, grabbed my keys, and drove with hands trembling against the steering wheel. Inside the evidence room, the clerk handed me a small velvet pouch. For a moment, I just stared, afraid to open it, afraid it might feel different somehow after all it had been through. Then, with slow fingers, I loosened the drawstring and saw the familiar stainless steel glint. The Rolex was right there, solid, heavy, unbroken by the lies and betrayal that had surrounded it. I slid it onto my wrist. The cool weight settled against my skin, and I almost swore I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. My breath caught, tears blurring the edges of the room. When I stepped outside, Margaret was waiting on the steps. Her face was drawn, eyes swollen from crying. She reached out as if unsure I would allow her near. Hannah, I am so sorry, she whispered. Gregory twisted me around for years. I let him make decisions that I should have questioned. I let myself believe loyalty meant silence. She swallowed hard. But I see now what that silence cost you. Please forgive me. The words hit me in waves. Part of me wanted to hold on to the anger to remind her of every moment she had looked away every time she had defended them. But another part, the part that remembered her laughter in the kitchen on Sunday mornings and the warmth she used to carry, saw how broken she was. I nodded slowly. This changes things, Mom. Forgiveness takes time. But admitting it matters. She clasped my hand for the briefest moment, her tears falling freely before turning to leave. Watching her walk away, I realized not everything had been healed, but something had shifted. Back in my apartment, I stood before the mirror, raising my wrist. The Rolex caught the light ticking steadily. For the first time in months, my reflection looked whole. It was not just about the watch, it was about justice, about proving that my father's trust in me had not been in vain. The following Monday, I returned to the agency. My desk was piled with memos, campaign drafts, and the usual clutter of deadlines. I expected frustration, maybe even resentment for having been away. Instead, Lauren Parker stepped into my office with a soft smile. Welcome back, Hannah. I know the past few weeks have been brutal, but I want you to know you handled it with a strength most people could never summon. Take today slow, ease back in. You've earned that. Her words loosened something in me I had not realized I was still gripping. I thanked her, promising to give my best, and sat down to the familiar rhythm of work. For the first time in a long time, my mind felt clear, as though I had carved out space for myself beyond grief and betrayal. Days passed into weeks. Ethan and Gregory faced charges. Their names appeared in small print in the Denver Post, stripped of the pride they had once carried like armor. Chloe never reached out, but I heard she moved back in with her parents, quietly rebuilding her life. Margaret began calling me occasionally, each conversation tentative but more honest than any we had shared in years. At night, when the apartment was quiet, I would sometimes rest my wrist on the arm of the chair, watching the steady motion of the Rolex hands. It was not just a timepiece. It was a promise kept, a bond with my father preserved. This story has been one of betrayal, loss, and struggle, but also one of courage, persistence, and truth. Justice is rarely quick, and it is almost never easy, but it is always worth pursuing. I learned that silence does not protect family, it corrodes it. Speaking up, even when your voice trembles, can restore more than property. It can restore dignity, trust, and peace. If you have ever fought to reclaim what was rightfully yours, or stood up for a truth no one else wanted to see, you know the weight and the relief of that moment. And if you are standing on the edge of that decision now, let this be a reminder. Do not let fear or manipulation silence you. My father's Rolex ticks beside me as I speak these words, steady and unyielding. It reminds me that time is precious, that love is worth defending, and that courage shapes the legacy we leave behind. If this story has moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you have ever faced something similar or what justice means to you. Like this video if you believe in standing up for yourself and for those you love. And if you want to hear more stories about courage, family, and truth, make sure to subscribe so we can keep walking through these journeys together. Because sometimes reclaiming what is stolen is not just about objects. It is about reclaiming yourself.